This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 957 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog. Thanks for tuning in. Now that we're in the fantasy playoffs, this podcast episode, the 15 transactions episode, it's going to change. There's no more buys. There's no more sells. We're just going to talk ads, drops, and holds. And honestly, it's mostly about ads, since that's the thing that's sort of usable for everyone. So I'll try to cover a wide range of ads each week on the show through week 17. So we've got 3 more of these before the season ends. Let's get some championships. Now, before getting into those transactions this week, I want to remind you to check out Underdog. Over on Underdog right now, you can check out snake drafts for this week's slate of games, but there's also tournaments for the NFL playoffs. Tournaments you can enter and draft in right now. Just head to UnderdogFantasy.com or download the Underdog app. If you're new to Underdog, make sure you use promo code LATEROUND when you sign up. You get a nice deposit offer as well as my rest of season rankings. But that's UnderdogFantasy.com, promo code LATEROUND. Add Isaiah Davis. So I didn't really get to talk about this Jets backfield on last week's 15 transaction show, because at that time, we didn't know that Breece Hall was going to miss week 14. With that being said, I did talk about it on Late Round Perspectives with Matt Schaff. It was more of a hypothetical then, though. We didn't know for sure at the time of that recording that Breece Hall was going to be out. We talked about Isaiah Davis's workload in week 13 and how he was getting more work specifically as a receiver than we expected him to get. And that made us question whether or not Braylon Allen was as good of a handcuff as we once thought. And unfortunately, at least for people who are stashing Braylon Allen, the backfield for the Jets in week 14 was basically a complete 50-50 split. Allen ran the ball 11 times, Davis ran it 10 times. Allen played just one more snap. Allen ran 22 routes, Davis ran 20. Like, you can't get more 50-50 than that. And I don't really think the Jets are doing the wrong thing here. Isaiah Davis was a good prospect, at least relatively speaking. Both him and Braylon Allen looked pretty good in the Zap model. And actually, for any of you guys who follow me on Twitter, back in April, you might remember a tweet where I sarcastically talked about the Jets ruining both of their fantasy values. Because I honestly was upset. I wanted both Braylon Allen and Isaiah Davis to get their own standalone opportunity. But instead, the Jets drafted both of them, and it was in a backfield with Breece Hall. It's not that the Jets did the wrong thing necessarily. It's more so that I wanted those guys to get some opportunity. And now we're sitting here with a split backfield as long as Breece Hall is sidelined. That's not a great thing in fantasy football. So right now, I'm just assuming that Braylon Allen is not on your waiver wire because most people added him last week. But if he is, yeah, you should go out and add him. But Isaiah Davis has just as much value right now as Allen does. And as a reminder, I've been talking about this for some time now, but as a reminder, according to Adjusted Fantasy Points Allowed, the Jets have the best playoff schedule for running backs. So both of these guys can be viable. It's just that moving forward, as long as Breece Hall is out, I think we're looking at a split backfield. Add Sincere McCormick. So I say this all the time, but the hardest part about running back evaluation in fantasy football, at least, is that a player's workload comes down to a coach's decision. And the Raiders this season have been all over the place with how they're deploying their running backs. Now, with Alexander Mattison, Zamir White still sidelined, Sincere McCormick saw a good bit of work on Sunday against the Buccaneers. Now, full disclosure, I thought Alexander Mattison was going to play this past week. When things started trending the other direction, I started talking about Sincere McCormick more and more on this podcast, or at least tried to give you guys some perspective. But McCormick handled 15 of a possible 16 running back rushes while playing 62% of the team snaps on Sunday. The one piece that's still kind of missing for McCormick is his pass catching. His route participation was just 24%. But the ground game work is definitely there. My fear with McCormick is we could face a predictability problem. Not only could the other backs on the Vegas roster return from injury, which will make things difficult to forecast, but McCormick hasn't been the team's pass catching back. Not yet. Amir Abdullah still ran more routes than McCormick did this past weekend. And with questionable quarterback play, the Raiders might find themselves in a negative game script a lot down the stretch. And that would not benefit Sincere McCormick. Now, one thing that could help the negative game script problem is that Vegas gets the Falcons, the Jags, and the Saints over their 3 playoff matchups. So there's a chance here that we're projecting McCormick to be sort of a high-end RB3, but then he has some upside if he's able to find the end zone. But if you're relying on McCormick, you need to hope that the Raiders want to give him the rock instead of Alexander Mattison or Zamir White if and when they return. Hold Justin Herbert. So it's been back-to-back bad weeks for Justin Herbert. He posted 8 fantasy points a couple of weeks ago against the Falcons, which was a plus matchup. He followed that up with 13.7 points against the Chiefs. But I would still hold tight. Herbert's going to rank fairly well this week because the Chargers get the Buccaneers. Tampa Bay is the second best matchup for quarterbacks by adjusted points allowed. The Chargers have an early team total around 24.5 points. Maybe you're going to have a better option. That's fine. But you may not want your opponents to have Justin Herbert in that spot. Add Jaleel McLaughlin. So McLaughlin could have made last week's show, if I'm being honest, but the Broncos were on bye. Chances were most teams weren't going to be aggressive in adding McLaughlin. And I don't think he's going to be like a league winner down the stretch. But the last time we saw Denver, McLaughlin hit a season high, by far, 64% running back rush share. According to Next Gen Stats, he's been much more effective than Javonte Williams this year when looking at basically any metric, and his success rate is about 10 percentage points higher than both Javonte Williams and Audric Estime. Denver has a reasonable schedule over the next 3 weeks, so maybe you get some usability from Jaleel McLaughlin. Add Sean Tucker. So we talked about adding Sean Tucker last week, but it's a transaction that needs to be repeated because Bucky Irving has this back injury. He missed most of Sunday's game. Now, Rachaad White ended up dominating the backfield snaps 47-11, at least compared to Sean Tucker. And White ran almost 3 times the number of routes. So this is not to say that Sean Tucker is going to be the 1A if Bucky Irving does miss time. But he should have a role. And there's a lot of running back needy teams out there. So go ahead and add him this week. Add Patrick Taylor and Izzy Abanikanda. So we have yet another 49ers running back injury. This time, it's Isaac Guerendo and his foot. It could keep him sidelined for San Francisco's Thursday night game against the Rams. We know he's hurt. We don't know if he's going to play. That means that we have to act. Patrick Taylor, according to most beat reporters, is the next man up. Just don't sleep on newcomer Izzy Abanikanda. He's a young, bigger-bodied back, and he has good speed that could fit in this system. He also has a little bit more of a history of being a bell cow than Patrick Taylor does. So Taylor seems like the guy that you got to go after this week, but don't sleep on Abanikanda. Maybe throw $1 or $2 at him. Drop Gus Edwards. Gus Edwards has not scored double-digit PPR points in a game this year. Now, some of that's due to injury, some of it's due to lack of opportunity, some of it is just because Gus Edwards isn't that great. Edwards has now played 2 games without J.K. Dobbins, and in those games, he scored 4.3 and 9.6 PPR points. He has 1 total target. Now, he found the end zone in a tough matchup against the Chiefs on Sunday, but he was also outsnapped by Kamani Vidal. Edwards is an early down running back who's going to be touchdown dependent. But even when he sees those scores, there's no guarantee that he's going to be that usable. Now, we've got 2 more games until J.K. Dobbins is back. The Chargers get the Bucs and the Broncos. Those are 2 bottom half matchups, but they're not terrible matchups. But you probably won't feel very confident starting Gus Edwards this week. And there's a chance that we see another dud. So throwing him onto the waiver wire, it might be beneficial. It might make sense. At least in shallower leagues where there's a lot more upside sitting on that wire. Add Kendre Miller. So I talked about Kendre Miller as an ad last week, but I want to give him another shout because we got more information about this backfield. And that information was that Miller was firmly in front of Jamal Williams in that New Orleans backfield. He had 18 snaps and Williams had 5. Miller was able to find the end zone too. Maybe New Orleans wants to give him some run as this season ends. Their schedule's pretty average overall, but in week 17, they do get the Raiders. That's not a bad matchup. Add Hollywood Brown. Now look, some of you guys are in deep leagues. This is most definitely a deep league recommendation. Hollywood Brown's been out all year with a shoulder injury, but Ian Rappaport, he said there's a chance that Brown could play in week 16 and 17. Now, it's going to be tough to project Brown as anything more than like a wide receiver 4 or wide receiver 5 in those games. But again, some of you are in deeper leagues. What I would do is just add him and see if we learn more information. See if Andy Reid comes out and gives us some idea of how they might deploy him. Because if those reports are favorable, you might be able to use him. Add Grant Calcaterra. So Dallas Goedert's on IR. I talked about Calcaterra on last week's Sleeper Show. He came through. He scored a touchdown. And in games where Goddard's missed time this year, Calcaterra has seen really good peripherals. Goddard's now missed 4 full games this year, and really, it's closer to 5 because in one of those games, he left very early. So in those 5 games, Calcaterra has seen route shares of 89%, 83%, 86%, 91%, and 89%. Those are very good numbers for a tight end. He has a 16% target share per game rate in those games. So even though the Eagles are a pretty run-heavy team, an obnoxiously run-heavy team, I do think Calcaterra is worth a look. Add Jerome Ford. Look, we know the Browns aren't a great football team, and when they hit a negative game script, Jerome Ford is going to be on the field. Ford has played at least half of the team's snaps in 3 of their last 4 games. His route share, it's been 54% since returning from injury in week 9. So he can get you like 7 or 8 PPR points if you're in a pinch. But there's also upside if Nick Chubb were to go down. So it makes sense to roster Ford. Add or hold Tajay Spears. Titans running backs have a really nice playoff schedule. I talked about this last week with Tony Pollard. They get the Bengals, Colts, and Jags in weeks 15, 16, and 17. Now, Tajay Spears has not been able to stay healthy all year, but he did hit a 22% running back rush share and a 6% target share in week 14, and he ran a route on 47% of Tennessee's dropbacks. That route participation was his highest since week 1. So not only could he maybe be useful in PPR formats, deeper PPR formats, but there is some upside for Spears if something were to happen to Tony Pollard, especially given that playoff schedule. Add Jalen Wright. So Raheem Mostert missed Sunday's game with a hip injury. That left Jalen Wright as the RB2 for Miami. Now that only turned into a 12% running back rush share and a 7% target share, but it does mean that Wright is one step closer to being the team's RB1, as long as Raheem Mostert stays sidelined. So he, like most running back handcuffs, is worth stashing. Add the Washington Commanders defense. The Commanders are coming off a bye. They get the Saints in week 15. New Orleans has been a top 10 opponent for fantasy defenses this year by adjusted fantasy points allowed. Now, they probably won't have Derek Carr. Reports are kind of all over the place, but he's trending in the wrong direction. Washington's a 7.5-point road favorite as a result, making them a top streaming choice. And to be clear, they're not even a bad option if Derek Carr does go. Add the Green Bay Packers defense. So take all of that same logic and just apply it to week 16, because the Packers get the Saints next week. And again, Derek Carr might be able to go, but he also might be sidelined. Regardless, Green Bay is at home and they're likely to be a big favorite. The Packers defense hasn't been playing bad over the last month, and in that spot, especially if Derek Carr is still sidelined, they should smash. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are registering for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter, @LateRoundQB. I'm also on Blue Sky. You can find me with the exact same handle. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly 10 Trends episode.